A communist revolution usually begins with an incredibly promising moral promise. People rebel against the capitalists and landowners to end exploitation, end chaos, end class divisions, and put history itself on the side of the ordinary worker. This promise created the big Soviet brother, Chairman Mao's China, as well as the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. Till this day, North Korea is one of the last places on Earth where the 20th century communist dream never really ended. The leaders' portraits are still on the walls. The slogans are still painted in heroic fonts. The party still speaks in the confident voice of a man explaining Marxism to a cow. And the state still insists that history has already chosen a winner. North Korea is, officially, a socialist paradise. The workers are supposed to own everything collectively. After the state and leadership finish the central planning as the embodiment of people's collective will, everyone performs their assigned job, and boom, everything magically works out. Here, private greed has been defeated by communist selflessness. Exploitation has been eliminated from the official dictionary. All class conflicts have been transcended by the Juche ideology. And the goddamned market, that vulgar little bazaar of selfish desires, has been morally replaced by a governmental distribution system. All of this sounds very impressive, right up until the moment somebody needs electricity, medicine, and food, and sadly, no one can provide them. To be fair, the socialist appeal was real. And Karl Marx did not invent poverty, nor any authoritarian government. The problem began when people started turning philosophy into a governing system. Nowhere did this reality survive more completely and bitterly than in North Korea, where Marx met monarchy, Lenin met Paektu bloodline, and the promised dictatorship of the proletariat somehow matured into a hereditary state run by a fat man holding nuclear buttons. If the Soviet Union was the first great communist experiment, and China the one that quietly smuggled incentives back in through the side door, North Korea is what happens when the system refuses to admit the machine is broken, and instead starts shouting at the machine. In this episode, we use North Korea as an apparent example to understand the systematic failure of the 20th century socialist movements. Why did the chaotic market competition create a flourishing economy, but the party's central planning only led to stagnation? Why didn't the Marxist manifesto create social democracy, but only lead to single-party dictatorship? And ultimately, why did the grand vision of human liberalization only bring endless repression and forever shortages? And as always, before we begin, a tribute to our channel members. It is your financial support that keeps this channel running and production going. With your help, we are finishing our first one-year plan. Thank you sincerely. Now, buckle up, let's begin.
We are a socialist country, so we stick to our socialist principles economically. We do not push for national reforms, adopting a market economy.
Socialism originated from human misery. That's right. Socialism, as a branch of modern economic and political philosophy, began as a serious moral accusation against the decadent capitalist world. In the 19th century, industrialism had created spectacular wealth, but it had also created a new kind of misery: urban poverty, brutal factory labor, child workers, slums, recurrent crises, and a social order in which the people who produced society's wealth usually had the least control over it. The old aristocracies still looked ridiculous. The new bourgeois elites looked smug. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people were told that this arrangement was somehow natural, modern, and even good for them in the long run. Under those conditions, socialism did not sound insane, but was a manifestation of social outrage. It was the ordinary workers who made everything, but why should their lives remain precarious while wealth piles up in capitalists' pockets? Why should production be organized for private profit rather than common need? Why should society accept a system that can produce both luxury and hunger at the same time? These were not foolish questions. They were the questions of an age that had seen too much exploitation to take the market's self-congratulation at face value. Here, the road diverges. One keeps capitalism. Private property remains legal, firms are privately owned, markets still allocate most goods, people can start businesses, invest, hire, fire, and compete. But on top of these, soften capitalism's uglier effects through taxation, social welfare, labor laws, public services, and market regulation. It gave rise to the modern high-tax, high-welfare Nordic countries, like Sweden and Norway, which are not socialist in the classical sense, but whose governments are redistributing wealth to make the unfortunate ones fed and happy. Then there is another path, the far more radical, hardcore socialist path. It does not just want to regulate the market, but replace it with centralized production and centralized distribution. That usually means major means of production, factories, land, banks, heavy industry, transport, sometimes even retail and agriculture, are collectively or state-owned. The economy is not supposed to be mainly coordinated by private profit and market competition, but by planning and directly serving people's needs. It brought us the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and Kim's Korea. They saw the market, and by extension, human selfishness and greed, as the problem. Once that diagnosis was made, the remedy naturally became far more ambitious than taxing the rich or a new labor law. Socialism began to present itself not merely as an economic rearrangement, but as a complete answer to society, a system that would end exploitation, reconcile class conflict, and perhaps even resolve the deeper miseries of human life. In the end, people will enter the final historical stage of communism, where everyone is eternally happy, satisfied, and self-realized. That, unsurprisingly, was an enormous promise. And once socialism began claiming that it could solve not just inequality, but the human condition itself, it started to resemble something more than politics. Communism became, in many ways, a secular inversion of Christianity, shaped by Hegel's idea of history moving toward an ultimate end. Marx treated religion as a form of alienation, famously calling it the opium of the people, and he expected religion, along with the political state, to be transcended once a real human community of equals had been built. In that sense, communism did not just reject Christianity's theology, it tried to replace Christianity's social role, its explanation of suffering, its moral language, and even its promise of redemption, just one you need to reach through a grateful death, and the other needs to be built by your own hands. At the same time, Marx, inspired by Hegel, asserts that history unfolds through development toward freedom. The Communist Manifesto writes that in bourgeois society, labor serves accumulated capital. In communist society, accumulated labor should serve human flourishing. But wait a second, what does it mean for humans to flourish? Marx was clear about what people should be freed from: exploitation, alienation, and class domination. He was less clear about what a fully flourishing human life should look like in practice. That ambiguity mattered. Later, communist revolutionaries all had their own theories on human realization and projected their will to reshape society. This is what made Marx, Lenin, Mao, and Kim Il-sung so compelling. They did not just say capitalism was unfair. Many people had already said that. They perpetuated the idea that socialism is history's final call in messianic terms. Capitalism was cast as a corrupt and transitional age, already doomed by the contradictions within it. Socialism, in turn, appeared as a secular form of redemption, one that would not merely overthrow bosses and factory owners, but lead humanity into its final, redeemed condition, not in the afterlife, but here on Earth. North Korea is one of the clearest examples of this transformation, partly because the country inherited a strong Christian past before it became one of the most aggressively anti-religious communist states in the world. Pyongyang was once famously nicknamed the Jerusalem of the East, due to its strong presence of Korean Protestantism. Kim Il-sung's mother, Kang Pang-sok, was a Presbyterian lay pastor. His father, Kim Hyong-jik, attended Sung-ho Missionary School and was a church organist. That helps explain why North Korean ideology often feels less like ordinary propaganda and more like a religious parody. The leader is the cult leader, the source of ultimate truth and authority. And the goal of the socialist revolution is not really to build a strong country, but a total redemption of human souls through collective efforts. Throughout the time, the great leader even revolted against foreign doctrinal dependency, established the Juche idea, and threw Marxism-Leninism into the historical garbage can. So, let us look at what the young People's Republic was actually promising. Kim Il-sung's new state did not merely claim that it would govern better than the Japanese Empire or the old landlord class. That would have been too modest. It claimed that it would inaugurate an entirely new historical era. After decades of colonial humiliation, poverty, and war, Korea would no longer be a victim of stronger powers or a convenient marketplace for collaborators, speculators, and assorted patriots for hire. Under socialism, the peasant finally got land. The worker became the master of the factory. Women would be lifted from what the regime called feudal backwardness and granted gender equality. Children would be educated to inherit and perfect the nation, and the country itself would at last stand upright on the world stage, no longer kicked around by history, but directing it. It's not just a fairer economy that allows workers to get paid more, but it was presented as a national purification. It would wash away the shame of colonial rule and build a new Korea, disciplined, dignified, modern, and morally clean. To be fair, the regime did offer some concrete things that mattered. The 1946 land reform broke up estates owned by landlords and collaborators and redistributed them to farmers. Nationalization transferred major industries out of private hands. Then came the rest of this big socialist package: literacy, mobilization, equality, healthcare, free housing, and freedom from worrying about food and safety. People no longer lived at the mercy of their boss. The peasant never bows to a landlord again. No foreign power manipulates the will of the people. It was an impressive offer, really. Bread, dignity, justice, sovereignty, and you name it. And in the first 2 decades, compared with the chaos, corruption, and inequality seen elsewhere, the Workers' Party central planning was somehow effective. But soon, the socialist cracks started to appear. This is where the overpromise began. A system can abolish private ownership on paper, but it cannot abolish the basic fact that people respond to incentives. Once effort, reward, and responsibility drift apart, production begins to depend less on initiative and more on quotas, paperwork, and political theatre. The factory may belong to the workers in theory, but in practice, it is often the managers and party officials who collect the real rewards. Then, the class struggle eliminates the old elite, but the hierarchy itself remains. It usually creates a new ruling class, one that speaks in the name of equality while enjoying privileges of its own. And because one-party systems have no safe way to manage disagreement, political struggle does not disappear. It just moves inward, where comrades accuse, purge, and destroy one another in the name of safeguarding the revolution.
Можно мне вас поцеловать, товарищ Сталин? За все! За все, что вы сделали для нашего народа! Для нас! Товарищ Сталин! Viva Stalin! Vive notre Stalin!
Мира и счастья всем вам, друзья мои!
For average workers, socialism is less philosophical, but more practical. The revolution wins, the landlords are gone, and then what? Even if the factory now belongs to the people, someone still has to show up on Monday morning and make the machine work. Steel still has to be poured, trains still have to move, grain still has to be harvested, and the production report, ideally, should describe reality rather than a patriotic hallucination. This is where the socialist promise runs into one of the oldest problems in politics and economics: incentives. In other terms, how to encourage workers to innovate and increase productivity. Once incentives go bad, people do not necessarily stop working, but certainly would stop working for the state and the collective good. Socialism fails because it weakens the connection between effort and personal reward, while creating a cognitive gap between reported success and actual success. If everything, including your work outcomes, is shared by everyone, why would you work hard and then let others collectively take the credit? Initially, the revolutionary ideals and propaganda did motivate people to triple their efforts for a brighter future. But over time, people learned that hard work doesn't lead to anything in the socialist hierarchy. Extra effort might bring little personal reward, but the real benefits go to managers, party secretaries, or the official who files the prettiest report, not the actual workers. Thus, workers adapt and do the bare minimum needed to stay safe. They chase the quota instead of the purpose. Their goal is to secure their livelihood, not to improve the system. North Korea's collective farm system is a very clear example. Nam Song-wook, the former chief of the South Korean Institute for National Security Strategy, argues that the North's chronic food problem is not only a technical problem of fertilizer, bad geography, or machinery. It's a management problem deeply rooted in the model of collective farming itself. Farmers must meet state procurement plans first, share output collectively, and finally surrender the extra grains to the government. If farmers cannot even keep more of their outputs, why should they work hard beyond the minimum requirement? This is precisely why later reforms kept circling back to responsibility systems, sub-work teams, and attempts to give farms or smaller units more control over output and profit. The Hungarian economist János Kornai spent much of his career explaining why the classical socialist economy developed a very specific kind of dysfunction. The issue was not that workers or managers in a socialist state were naturally less diligent or smart than people elsewhere. It was that the institutional signals were wrong. In a system of dominant state ownership and bureaucratic coordination, firms were often protected by what Kornai called a soft budget constraint. If an enterprise failed, the state frequently rescued it, tolerated losses, or adjusted targets rather than letting it disappear. That meant managers were disciplined less by consumers, profit, and bankruptcy than by administrative orders, political priorities, and the expectation that failure would still be tolerated from above. The result was chronic shortage, weak cost control, overinvestment in politically favoured sectors, and a constant temptation to satisfy the plan on paper rather than social need in reality. In such an environment, people do not simply stop working, but learn to optimize within it. Factory managers are not incentivized to launch new products, since their wages are fixed and low. But these officials can abuse their power to trade favors, divert inputs, tolerate informal side production, demand bribes for approvals, or quietly move goods from the state sector into the market. In North Korea, this became especially visible after the collapse of the public distribution system in the 1990s. Christopher Carothers notes that many officials came to rely on bribes and illicit earnings because state salaries were negligible. So the system did not abolish self-interest. It merely drove self-interest underground and taught people to profit from scarcity, access, and administrative ambiguity. Moreover, once the system stops rewarding actual efforts, it begins rewarding obedience to the central planning. Then, the people in command, like local managers, farm cadres, and plant directors, suddenly gain a dangerous new talent: the ability to lie upward. They do not really want to destroy socialism, quite the opposite. They are surviving it. If grain targets are unrealistic, if housing goals are politically announced before the raw materials exist, if reporting failure means humiliation or dismissal, then the only rational response is to polish the numbers, trim the truth, and hope that a carton of cigarettes can bribe the entire inspection team. In that sense, the local manager becomes both the servant and the saboteur of the socialist system. He keeps the machine running by falsifying its dashboard. By Kim Il-sung's later years, North Korea had become very good at hiding how poor it was. Food had to be imported, rationing tightened, and shortages worsened. Yet the political machine still produced triumphant statistics. Just a month before the great leader's death, he angrily held a cabinet meeting and scolded officials for falsifying grain harvest reports. The same problem hasn't been resolved even today. In January 2026, Kim Jong-un publicly fired Vice Premier Yang Sung-ho over problems in the modernization of the Ryong-song machine complex, saying the project had suffered not a small amount of economic loss because of irresponsible and incompetent officials. Why were the officials irresponsible and incompetent? I think you have the answers now. The dismissal was framed as a push for accountability ahead of February's 9th Party Congress. Our supreme leader used one unlucky vice premier to send alerts to other party officials. At the same time, it reveals the bigger structural problem. The project goes wrong, experiences losses, and the correct move is not to admit that command systems only reward flattery and fakery, but to sacrifice a bureaucrat and shamefully fire him in public. Ryong-song was not an accident. In July 2024, Kim also sacked officials over the handling of the Samjeon New Town project, which state media had labelled a socialist utopia. The leader said there had been poor construction work and financial losses. He suspended the construction control minister, criticised the work as outdated and backward, and ordered remodelling that essentially led to even further losses. These are the typical steps of the command economy theatre. First, announce the plan to build a utopia. Then, build it badly. The leader then blames cadres for insufficient reverence. Then, spend more resources correcting the badly built utopia. Finally, it's a complete failure, but everyone pretends that they have succeeded far beyond the initial planning. Under capitalism, even a very ugly, bloody type of capitalism, a small shopkeeper, trader, or entrepreneur usually has a fairly direct relationship between effort and reward. Work harder, organize better, and judge demand correctly, and there is at least a chance of earning more. Fail badly enough, and the market eventually gives your business a death sentence. Under the harder socialist model, that line gets blurred. The worker is told he owns the factory collectively, which is a very noble sentiment, but he experiences this ownership in much the same way medieval peasants experience sovereignty. It is just an abstract concept explained to him by other people, and it doesn't much affect his actual work days. If the factory exceeds its target, the worker may get praise, perhaps a bonus, perhaps another lecture about socialist devotion. The plant manager, meanwhile, gets the promotion, and the cadre who kept headquarters happy gets the better apartment. The worker discovers that he is supposedly the master of production, yet somehow remains suspiciously similar to an employee. So it is not hard to understand why so many North Koreans drifted into smuggling, private trade, and black market activity. This was not some grand ideological awakening or answering to the capitalist call. It was a practical response to a system that often failed to deliver reliable livelihoods. Since the collapse of the public distribution system in the 1990s, informal markets have become a primary source of income for many ordinary North Koreans, even as the state continues to speak the language of planned equality. Research on North Korean marketization shows that income from market activity quickly became a major determinant of perceived status, precisely because the official command economy was failing to provide. In other words, the market restored something the socialist system had completely lost: a visible link between effort, risk, and reward. A trader who bought cheap and sold dear could earn cash immediately. A smuggler who moved goods across borders could make far more than a loyal worker waiting for official rations. Even ordinary families could use petty trade, barter, or informal services to get food, consumer goods, and a margin of independence from the state. Socialism fails because it only offers equality on paper, but the market can deliver noodle to your table tonight.
Accelerating socialist construction to the maximum by a powerful speed campaign is precisely the decisive guarantee for socialism to overwhelm capitalism imperialism. The guiding ideology and theory of the Workers' Party of Korea, which gives priority to ideological work and arouses the popular masses to creative endeavors, are the secret for advancing the socialist economy and effecting its leap forward in spite of the imperialists' malicious economic blockade.
Bad incentives are only part of the socialist tragedy. Even if every tractor factory had somehow run on pure revolutionary zeal, there was still a much larger elephant in the control room: power. Marx's theory describes history as a struggle between classes. In the Communist Manifesto, class conflict is not some unfortunate side effect of bad economic policy, but the engine of history itself, the force that drives one social order to overthrow another. The revolution, then, is supposed to end exploitation by destroying the old ruling class and placing power in the hands of the proletariat. On paper, that sounds pretty nice. But the trouble begins the moment when the old enemy is defeated and the state needs to decide who the new enemy is. In a one-party system, that answer usually turns out to be whoever is standing a little bit too far from the supreme leader. That is the second great overpromise of hardcore socialism. It claims to abolish bourgeois domination, but it can do nothing about political struggle. Socialism simply moves that struggle inside the ruling party. The communist countries call themselves dictatorships of the people, and so once they establish themselves, there would be no opposition parties, no free elections, no independent press, and no lawful way to challenge leadership. As a result, disagreement often becomes deadly. A policy dispute is no longer a disagreement about steel output or housing targets, but quietly brews factionalism, ideological deviation, revisionism, or even treason. The old war of class never ends, but only turns inward. Stalin showed this logic in its most famous form. The Soviet Union had already defeated the old aristocratic order and established communist rule in the 1930s. But guess what? There is no peace, but only years of the Great Purge. Old Bolsheviks, military officers, officials, and ordinary citizens were dragged into fabricated cases and coerced confessions. Many were forced into trials, imprisoned, or even executed. In other words, the socialist state that was supposedly owned by the single class of proletariat became obsessed with accusing hidden traitors inside its own ranks without any evidence. The chairman Mao of China took the same habit and gave it a revolutionary makeover. The Cultural Revolution was launched in 1966, not because Mao wanted to consolidate his position in the party hierarchy, but because he believed the revolution itself was decaying. The great leader feared China was drifting toward the Soviet model, worried about his own place in history, and wanted to replace less faithful successors, rectify the party, and renew the revolutionary spirit. So, after winning one revolution, he launched another revolution, this time against the people who had fought the first one with him. That's truly one battle after another. Red Guards were encouraged to attack officials, old culture, suspected ideological enemies, and hidden bourgeois infiltrators. Then, you know the result. People thought they had built a new classless society. But it turned out that the revolution never ends, nor do the purges. Class struggles and revolution are two tricky and slippery concepts. You can use them elastically and call any of your political rivals the class enemy or anti-party revisionists, and then purge them in the name of revolution. North Korea apparently inherited this whole socialist tradition. Kim Il-sung built his country out of Marxism-Leninism, Soviet state practice, Chinese influence, and Korean nationalism, then gradually trimmed away everything that might compete with his own authority. After the Korean War, Kim, a guerrilla hero from Manchuria, backed by the big Soviet brother, purged the domestic factions, blaming them amid the post-war wreckage. After the 1956 crisis, he moved against both the pro-Chinese Yan'an faction and the pro-Soviet camp. This is where the Juche idea enters the story, and it is more interesting than the tourist brochure version of self-reliance. We already have an episode on it, so please go watch it if you haven't, and we won't go into full length here. In a nutshell, Kim Il-sung publicly introduced the term Juche in 1955, but the Juche philosophy was only theorized and systematized later. It was done by Kim Il-sung's ghostwriter, Hwang Jang-yop, who was trying to solve a real problem of 20th century communism. If Marxism-Leninism claims to liberate humanity, why does it keep producing dictatorship, purges, and a party that devours its own believers? Hwang's answer, at least in his later telling after defection, was that orthodox communism had reduced history too much to economic structure, class struggle, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. In his view, that made human beings look like instruments of historical law rather than active subjects of history. Comrades purging comrades were not singular accidents caused by bad men. They were encouraged by a theory of beating down your enemies through brutal force. Once politics is organized entirely around class struggle, the system never runs out of enemies. And because the leader always claims to speak for the class egoism slowly mutates into leadership egoism, then into a full cult of personality. This is why Huang later argued that his human-centered Juche philosophy was meant to overcome class struggle theory and even the dictatorship of the proletariat. Its best-known formula is that man is the master of everything and decides everything. In this version, the driving force of history is not merely conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but the conscious, creative, independent activity of the people. It was, at least in theory, a move from class war to human agency. And that is what makes Huang such an interesting figure. He was not merely another court intellectual polishing the leader's vanity into philosophical prose. Comrade Huang deserves to be taken seriously because he identified a real theoretical flaw in 20th century communism. From Stalin's terror to Mao's Cultural Revolution to Kim Il-sung's own factional purges, the same pattern kept returning, and it must be something rotten at the core. The sad part is what happened next. By the time Juche matured into a full philosophical system, North Korea had become a monster. It had already been swallowed by Kim Il-sung's cult of personality and reshaped into a monolithic political order. So Huang's attempt to move from class war to human agency did not actually restrain power. It was absorbed by power. Man is the master of everything sounded noble enough until the regime quietly decided that the leader was the supreme interpreter of all philosophical thinking. The Juche idea became another religious doctrine used by the Kims to explain why suffering exists. People must tighten their belts because they are the masters of their own destiny. In February 1997, Hwang Jang-yop, then the highest-ranking North Korean official ever to defect, entered the South Korean diplomatic mission in Beijing and sought asylum. Because he had been one of the regime's most senior ideologues, the move caused a huge shock. One report at the time compared it to Joseph Goebbels defecting from Nazi Germany. In Seoul, he became one of Kim Jong-il's harshest critics and lived under heavy protection for years. And then came the cruelest confirmation of his own theory. If Hwang was right that communist politics kept turning comrades into enemies, his own family paid the price in real life. After his defection, Hwang's wife in North Korea died by suicide. One daughter was also reported to have died, with accounts describing her death as suicide on the way to a labor camp. Other family members, including children and grandchildren, were widely believed to have been sent to prison camps or punished under North Korea's system of guilt by association. Hwang had tried to argue that the true subject of history should be the human being, not the class. But in the end, his entire family was purged as the enemy class of the people.
Anyone with a certain level of knowledge and abilities has the right to freely participate in the state's administration as civil servants. The people are provided with the right to freely choose and believing in ideology and religion. The Juche idea, which thoroughly defends and champions the people's independence, guarantees genuine people's rights. The Korean people believe in the Juche idea and think and behave as required by this idea.
Here we face the final boss, the dictator. Once socialism has weakened incentives and turned class struggle into internal party warfare, there is only one stable way left to hold things together. A great man must rise above the factions and the bureaucracy, representing all the workers and farmers across the country, and introducing himself as the Messiah to the country's future. Think about it. The production plan is falling behind. The officials are abusing the system. Comrades are fighting comrades, and the economy is coughing blood. So what does the system do? Often people turn into dictators and hope this marvelous man solves the problems all at once. In that sense, dictatorship is not some accidental side effect of hardline socialism. It is often the emergency repair kit. This is exactly the story of Kim Il-sung, not merely as North Korea's founding father, but as the political solution to socialism's deeper contradictions. If the party is full of factions, then the leader must rise above the party. If cadres disagree, then the leader must become the final judge. That condition, unfortunately, was very convenient for Kim. In the early years, he was hardly the only Korean communist with credentials. There were men with longer revolutionary resumes, deeper roots in colonial Korea, stronger party networks, and their own ideas about how a socialist Korea should be built. Colonial Korea had already produced a communist party back in 1925, with its own leaders, including figures like Pak Hon-yong and Kim Jae-bong. Some of these men later worked with Kim in the Korean War against the South. But once the war was over, Kim gradually purged them all. Pak Hon-yong, once the chairman of the Communist Party of Korea's Central Committee, was eventually executed on the fabricated charge of being an American spy. In a socialist dictatorship, yesterday's comrade is often tomorrow's foreign agent. Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung came from a rather different path. He joined the Chinese Communist Party in 1931, held various posts there, and by some accounts was more comfortable speaking Chinese than Korean. In 1942, he was assigned to the Soviet Red Army, which kept him in the Soviet Union until 1945. After Japan's surrender, the Soviets occupied the North and needed a Korean communist who was young enough, loyal enough, and politically manageable enough to build into a ruler. Kim fitted the role, since he was strongly opposed to talking to the South Syngman Lee's government. Thus, Kim Il-sung had his Korean Peninsula debut at the famous Pyongyang mass rally on October 14, 1945. The next year, Stalin helped him to merge all the different existing communist cliques on the peninsula into the Workers' Party of Korea, turning communist chaos into a one-party state and appointing Kim as party chairman. So, Kim was not the obvious heir to the Korean communist movement. He only succeeded in the chair by outlasting, outmaneuvering, and eventually eliminating other candidates. It was the establishment of the Workers' Party that gave him an organizational weapon to absorb and purge all his rivals, and to turn the People's Republic into a socialist monarchy. This is why socialism, in its Leninist form, keeps drifting toward dictatorship. Socialism requires a centralized political system and a party state. Then, the party's internal warfare inevitably brews into an authoritarian dictatorship. Milan Svolik, professor of political science at Yale University, argues that authoritarian regimes face two conflicts at once, one with the masses below, and one with elites inside the regime. In a democracy, those conflicts are managed, though imperfectly, by elections, congressional debates, and independent institutions. There will be different parties representing different interest groups. But socialist countries have no such balancing mechanisms. So when political conflicts continue inside the ruling camp, nobody can make a decision, and the system naturally craves a supreme arbiter. From this perspective, Kim Il-sung's rise makes perfect sense. Early North Korea was a crowded and unstable coalition of communist factions. Domestic communists rooted in colonial Korea, Soviet Koreans obeying the Soviet orders, the Yan'an faction doing China's favor, and Kim's own guerrilla circle from Manchuria. Meanwhile, the bloody power struggle continued within the party hierarchy. That meant the new regime faced not just the problem of controlling society, but the equally dangerous problem of controlling itself. In such a setting, A leader who can present himself as the only man capable of standing above divisions starts to look less like a historical accident and more like a structural temptation. Kim's genius, if one wants to call it that, was to turn that temptation to his advantage and build a Stalinist personality cult. The 1956 de-Stalinization crisis made this even clearer. After Khrushchev attacked Stalin's cult of personality, communist systems across the bloc came under pressure to reduce leader worship and tolerate more collective leadership. In theory, that should have made North Korea less despotic. However, Kim moved in the opposite direction, which is not surprising at all. De-Stalinization threatened the very mechanism by which Kim was solving the regime's internal conflict. Collective leadership would have empowered rival elites inside the party. Criticism of the personality cult would have weakened the symbolic hierarchy that kept those elites in line. And when Soviet and Chinese representatives later tried to pressure Kim into softening his purge of the August faction, he seems to have understood the lesson immediately. Outside patrons and inside rivals could combine to constrain him. So he did not liberalize, but chose to double down, treating the foreign intervention not as a friendly correction, but as a warning that the personality cult was not yet complete. The same socialist logic could push a European state in a remarkably similar direction. Romania also began with the familiar Leninist formula: abolish opposition, nationalize the economy, subordinate society to the party, and call the result the dictatorship of the people. All sorts of problems arose. Then, Nicolae Ceausescu entered the picture and eventually turned the beautiful Balkan country into his family business. These socialist republics were still full of committees, ministries, and all the normal furniture of modern government, but the real political gravity had always shifted upward into one family and even one person. When socialism destroys external opposition and keeps purging internal comrades, facing the chaos, having a supreme leader was the only result. There ain't no good things when a dictator comes. The supreme leader not only silences people, but also intimidates them into compliance. People accustomed to the feeling of clapping tirelessly, praising what they do not believe, calling consistent shortage short-term sacrifice, and demonstrating their loyalty in public. The state may still call this national liberation, but by this point, liberation has become a very exhausting performance. This is the real misery of living in a hardline communist state. It is not just poverty or censorship, it is the feeling that reality itself has been nationalized and controlled by the state and the leader. No newspaper can print the truth. Every factory report is fabricated. The local cadre only cares about their own profits. The neighbour may not dare to share their actual feelings. You even need to manage your facial expression when meeting other comrades. In such a system, survival depends less on what you produce than on what you conceal, what you repeat, and what you pretend not to notice. And the tragedy is that this misery grows out of a promise that once sounded humane. The revolution said it would end exploitation. Instead, it often created a world in which ordinary people were still squeezed, only now by a state that claimed to be squeezing them for their own good. It said it would abolish class domination. Instead, it produced new elites, party cadres, security officials, managers, and the families around them. People who always seemed to live just a little better than the workers they represented. It said it would put history on the side of the ordinary person, Instead, the ordinary person was asked to wait, sacrifice, obey, and keep waiting while history took a very long time upstairs. The dictator makes all of this worse because he turns a broken system into a sacred one. Once one man becomes the only source of truth, then there is no truth anymore, only the leader's words. It is humiliating when you stand in line, queuing for rations, and are told you live in a paradise. You experience indignity when hearing the workers are masters of the state, while watching officials behave like feudal landlords in better suits. The socialist misery is the quiet acknowledgement that everyone around you understands the lie, but no one dares to say so. The cult of personality gives your suffering meaning. Pain is endured because it is said to build redemption within this world, under the guidance of the leader. The promised paradise is always just ahead, and the misery of the present becomes the necessary road toward it. You're hungry because you are contributing to the revolution. You are poor because you are morally cleaner than the decadent capitalist enemy. This is also why dictatorship is so hard to escape psychologically. A normal bad government can be hated as merely incompetent. A cult regime tries to become emotionally necessary. It wants citizens to feel that without the leader, their suffering would remain and become meaningless. Then, it feels better to suffer under a national father than to suffer alone. In the end, the 20th century hardline one-party socialist experiment could be one of history's cruelest jokes. A movement that began by claiming to restore humanity ended by making people suffer and frightened. And when the dictator finally stands above the wreckage, smiling from a portrait while the people below keep pretending, the system reveals what it really became. Not the end of history, but the long grey punishment for believing that politics could redeem our self-destructive human nature.